Many people's biggest fear is being buried alive. The thought of slowly running out of breath as you try to scratch your way out of a wooden box is absolutely terrifying. In this video we count down 5 people who are buried alive. James Hatcher was one of the wealthiest, most renowned citizens to ever grace the small town of Pikeville, Kentucky. He engaged in several successful business ventures in the coal mining and timber industries. He owned property reaching from Pikeville to present-day Coal Run. Later in life, Hatcher built the hotel James Hatcher in Pikeville, where the East Kentucky Exposition Center is now. The hotel was known for Hatcher's favorite sayings and quotes, which he had printed on the walls of the hotel lobby. A small museum was in one of the rooms of the famous reception area, displaying among other things an iron lung, the newest piece of medical technology of its day. The hotel was advertised as being fireproof and offered guests the security of being able to sleep in safety. Also on display in the lobby was James Hatcher's own casket, which he had specifically crafted years prior to his death. This coffin was special. It was latched on the inside and had to be sealed with a special tool that would then be pulled out when the body was buried. James Hatcher had a severe phobia of being buried alive, and not without reason. In 1889, Hatcher was married in Pikeville to young Octavia Smith. Their marriage would be tragically brief and produce only one son, Jacob, who died shortly after he was born. The infant mortality rate in the 1890s was much higher than today's numbers. During the 1800s, children often died of one illness or another before the age of 10. There were very few vaccines and medications for treatment, and illnesses that are minor today were then fatal. One of such sicknesses took the life of young Jacob Hatcher. The baby's death led to a depression and illness that would soon end Octavia's own life. Jacob died in January 1891. Octavia took to her bed, likely suffering from depression. She grew ill over the next few months, slipping into a coma from which she could not be awakened. She was pronounced dead of unknown causes on May 2nd, 1891. That spring was unusually hot, and as embalming was not yet common practice, no time was wasted in burying Octavia. Funeral services were conducted and her body was laid to rest. Several days later, others began exhibiting similar symptoms to Octavia's. The bite of a certain fly, now known as the tsetse fly, brought a sleeping sickness from which others began to awaken after a time. Hatcher and his family began to worry if Octavia might have succumbed to this illness. Her breathing had been shallow enough in her coma state for doctors to believe she had passed, but she had actually been buried alive. Hatcher secured an emergency exhumation and uncovered a horrific sight with the raising of the coffin. The casket Octavia had been buried in had not been airtight. She had awoken from her sleep to find herself trapped beneath the ground. In a panic, she had torn the lining on the lid of her coffin. Her nails were bloody and her face was contorted in terror. She tried to scratch through the coffin to escape from her grave, but this time she really was dead. Her body was reburied, but James was never the same. He had a life-size, lifelike monument to Octavia erected over her grave. In one arm the statue held a baby representative of Jacob. He built the Hatcher Hotel at such an angle that he could look upon the cemetery at his young wife, and she could symbolically look down on him. The legend was born with the statue's completion. Vandals invaded the Hatcher cemetery plot and broke the arm holding the baby from the monument. Now the infant lies on the ground at Jacob's grave near the foot of his mother, but the stories do not stop there. In the 1990s, the Hatcher family erected a fence around the plot, an attempt to keep future vandalism from occurring. The statue was placed on a new marble base so it would be less accessible. Pikeville residents who lived near the Hatcher plot reported hearing the sounds of a kitten crying from the area. The sound stopped when they approached the plot to investigate. Others said they could hear a woman crying coming from the same area. In July 1893, a farmer named Charles Boger and his wife were living in Pennsylvania when Mrs. Boger suddenly died of unknown causes. Dr. James Willard, the family physician, made several tests to make sure that the death had taken place. After these tests, Mrs. Boger was buried. Sometime afterwards, a friend informed Boger that his wife had been the subject of periodic hysteria and suggested that she might have been buried alive. This thought haunted Boger until he became practically insane. It was arranged that the grave should be reopened. To the shock of Boger's friend, his fears were proven correct. The woman had been buried alive. The body was turned face down. The glass in the lid of the coffin was broken. The burial robes had been torn to shreds, and bruises and gashes in the woman's flesh showed where she'd torn herself in frenzy upon discovering her hopeless situation. Angelo Hayes was a French celebrity and inventor. He is best known for having survived a premature burial for 2 days. Hayes was involved in a motorcycle accident in which he was thrown from his vehicle head-first into a brick wall. The doctors were unable to find a pulse and Hayes was declared dead. His face had been so disfigured by the impact that his parents were not allowed to view his body. He was buried 3 days later. 2 days after the funeral, when Hayes was exhumed for the purpose of an insurance investigation, forensic examiners were surprised to find the body was still warm. They found that Hayes had been in a coma resulting from his head injury. His body's diminished need for oxygen had allowed him to survive for 2 days underground. Following several surgeries and rehabilitation, Hayes made a complete recovery and went on to become a minor French celebrity. People travelled from afar to speak with him, and in the 1970s he went on tour with a security coffin he invented, which featured a food locker, chemical toilet, library and radio transmitter. On rare occasions, people have arranged to be buried alive, reportedly as a demonstration of their controversial ability to survive such an event. A Russian man died after persuading a friend to bury him alive for a night, hoping it would bring him good luck. The victim dug a hole in the garden and climbed into an improvised coffin, with holes for air pipes, taking a mobile phone and a bottle of water with him. His friend covered the coffin with earth and then left. Shortly after, the man phoned his friend to say he was fine. The next morning he returned to find his friend dead. The 35-year-old victim had believed that burying himself alive for a night would bring him good luck for the rest of his life. According to his friend, the man wanted to test his endurance. The victim was a computer programmer and he had a small child. It seems that overnight rain may have blocked the air pipes and left the man to suffocate in his own casket. Stephen Small was a businessman in Illinois. In 1987, he was kidnapped and held for ransom by Danny Edwards and Nancy Risch. The conditions of his confinement caused him to die of asphyxiation. Around 12:30 AM on September 2, 1987, someone claiming to be a police officer called the Small home and told Stephen that a burglary had occurred at the Bradley house, a property that Small owned and was in the process of renovating. Small got dressed and left his home. Around 3:30 that morning, someone called the Small residence and told Stephen's wife Nancy, "We have your husband." Nancy then heard her husband say that he'd been handcuffed inside a box underground. Small told his wife to obtain $1 million in cash. The caller directed Mrs. Small not to report the matter to the police. The matter was reported to the authorities, and devices were connected to the Small's telephone line to record incoming calls and to determine their origins. At 5:03 that afternoon, the same person called again, asking Mrs. Small how much money had been collected. This call was placed from a telephone located at Phillips gas station in Amora Park. Edwards was seen there at the time in the company of a blonde-haired woman. At 5:40 PM, Jean Alice Small, Stephen Small's aunt, telephoned the Small residence to tell them of a call that she had just received. Jean said that the caller had told her that she knew that Nancy Small's phone was taped. After telling Jean that the victim was buried, the caller threatened to kill Jean's husband. Nancy Small received another telephone call from the kidnapper at 11:28 that night. This call originated from a telephone at a station in Aroma Park, where an FBI agent saw a white male at a telephone, and a blonde-haired woman in a car that was later identified as belonging to Nancy Risch. The caller played a tape recording of Stephen Small's voice. On the tape, Stephen provided instructions for delivering the ransom. After audio enhancement, a voice in the background could be heard threatening Small. Police were only able to find Mr. Small by locating his maroon Mercedes near the burial site. Since Edwards and Risch were convicted, there has been some debate with the testimonies over whether or not the two intended for Mr. Small to die in his coffin. Either way, it was a horrific crime with tragic consequences. The jury found Edwards guilty of first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping. A capital sentencing hearing was then conducted. At the first stage of the hearing, the jury found Edwards eligible for the death penalty because of his commission of murder during the course of another felony, aggravated kidnapping. On the 1st of October, Risch was charged by indictment with first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping for her alleged role in Small's death. On November 2, 1988, Risch was tried by a jury. No direct evidence was presented linking her to the kidnapping or death of Small. However, the state was able to enter Risch's 8 inconsistent statements into evidence. The jury found Risch guilty on both accounts, and the trial court sentenced her to a term of natural life imprisonment and a 30-year term. So that was 5 people who were buried alive. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more countdown videos.